The morning sun was barely up when Catherine Hayes walked through the gates of Camp Lejeune for her first day as an instructor. She was 45 years old, wearing a simple blazer and slacks, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail. She carried a leather briefcase that had seen better days and wore comfortable flats instead of heels. Nothing about her screamed military. Nothing about her demanded attention, and that was exactly the problem. The hallway leading to classroom B7 was filled with the sounds of boots on linoleum and the low rumble of young voices. She could feel eyes on her as she passed groups of Marines in their crisp uniforms. A few nodded politely, but most just stared with barely concealed curiosity. She was used to it by now. After 3 months of working at the base, she still felt like an outsider. Catherine reached the classroom door and paused for just a moment, taking a deep breath. Through the small window, she could see them already inside. 23 Marines, all in their 20s, sitting in scattered groups, laughing and talking. They looked so young to her, so confident, so sure of themselves in a way she remembered being once, a lifetime ago. She pushed open the door and walked to the front of the room. The conversations didn't stop right away. A few Marines glanced up, then went back to their discussions. She set her briefcase down on the desk with a soft thud and turned to face them. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady but not loud. "I'm Catherine Hayes, and I'll be your instructor for advanced combat tactics and strategy." The room gradually quieted down, but it wasn't the respectful silence she'd hoped for. It was more like the awkward pause when someone interrupts a good conversation. She could see it in their faces. The skepticism, the doubt. One young corporal in the front row leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a small smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. Catherine had replaced their previous instructor, a retired colonel who'd been teaching at the base for nearly a decade. The Marines had loved him. He'd been one of them through and through. And now they had her, a civilian, a woman, someone who looked like she should be teaching high school history, not military tactics. She started her presentation, clicking through slides about strategic positioning and tactical decision-making. She talked about the importance of understanding terrain, of anticipating enemy movements, of making split-second decisions under pressure. She'd prepared for weeks, making sure every point was clear, every example relevant, but she could feel the room slipping away from her. In the third row, 2 lance corporals were whispering to each other, not even trying to hide it. One of them laughed quietly at something his buddy said. Catherine paused, looking directly at them. They met her gaze without apology and only barely lowered their voices. She continued, describing a scenario involving an urban combat situation. "In this type of environment," she explained, "you need to consider multiple entry points, potential ambush locations, and civilian presence. The decision you make in the first 30 seconds can determine whether your entire squad makes it out alive." "Ma'am," a voice called out from the back. It was a sergeant, probably 26 or 27, with sharp features and sharper eyes. "Have you ever actually been in that situation? Like in real life?" The question hung in the air. Catherine felt every pair of eyes turn to her. She knew this moment would come eventually. "It always did, I have," she said simply. "But we're here to talk about your training, not my experience." "Right," the sergeant said, not bothering to hide the doubt in his voice. "It's just, it helps to know if someone's talking from experience or just from a book." A few Marines nodded in agreement. One of them muttered something under his breath that got a few quiet chuckles from those nearby. Catherine felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her voice calm. "I understand your concern. What matters is that the tactics I'm teaching you are sound and have been proven effective in real combat situations." "By other people," someone said from the middle of the room. It wasn't quite loud enough for her to identify who said it, but it was loud enough for everyone to hear. The rest of the class period went downhill from there. When she asked questions, she got silence or half-hearted responses. When she tried to engage them in discussion about tactical scenarios, most of them just stared at her with blank expressions. A few were openly on their phones, not even pretending to pay attention. Catherine pushed through, maintaining her professionalism even as frustration built in her chest. She'd dealt with worse than this, much worse, but something about the casual disrespect, the assumption that she didn't belong here, dug under her skin in a way that actual danger never had. When the class finally ended, the Marines filed out quickly, eager to be anywhere else. Catherine heard fragments of their conversations as they left. This is going to be a long semester. I can't believe they stuck us with her instead of getting another real instructor. My little sister could teach this class. At least she'd make it interesting. Catherine stood at the front of the empty classroom, staring at the slides still displayed on the screen behind her. She'd spent so many hours preparing this material. She'd tried so hard to make it relevant, practical, useful, and they'd looked at her like she was wasting their time. She closed her laptop slowly, the click of it shutting echoing in the quiet room. Through the window, she could see groups of Marines walking across the parade ground, their movements sharp and purposeful. They moved like they owned the place, like they belonged. She picked up her briefcase and headed for the door. In the hallway, she passed a bulletin board covered with photos from recent training exercises. Young faces covered in camouflage paint grinning at the camera. Unit patches and motto plaques lined the walls. Everything here spoke of brotherhood, of tradition, of belonging to something bigger than yourself. Catherine had once belonged to that world too, but that was a long time ago. A different life. She'd left that person behind, or at least she'd tried to. Now she was just a civilian instructor, someone these young Marines saw as an outsider trying to tell them how to do their jobs. As she walked to her small office at the end of the building, she wondered, not for the first time, if this had been a mistake. Maybe she should have stayed in the private sector, doing consulting work for defense contractors. The pay would have been better and she wouldn't have to face this constant wall of skepticism. But something had pulled her back here. Maybe it was the desire to pass on what she knew, to help the next generation avoid the mistakes she'd seen cost lives. Or maybe it was something deeper, something she didn't want to examine too closely. Either way, she was here now, and she'd made a commitment. She just had to figure out how to get through to them, how to make them see that she wasn't their enemy. She was here to help them survive. Catherine sat down at her desk and opened her briefcase. Inside was her lesson plan for tomorrow's class. She stared at it for a long moment, then pulled out a red pen and started making notes. If they wouldn't respect her credentials, maybe she could at least earn their respect through the quality of her teaching. It was going to be a long road, but she'd walked longer roads before. 3 weeks had passed since Catherine's first day, and things had only gotten worse. What started as skepticism had hardened into something uglier: open disrespect. It was Tuesday morning, and she was already running late. Her car had refused to start, and by the time she'd gotten a ride to base, her first class had already begun. She rushed down the hallway, her briefcase bumping against her leg, and pushed through the classroom door. The room was in chaos. Marines were scattered everywhere, some sitting on desks, others standing in groups, all talking loudly. No one was in their assigned seat. No one even looked up when she entered. "Good morning," Catherine said, raising her voice to be heard over the noise. "Please take your seats so we can get started." The conversations continued. A few Marines glanced her way but didn't move. One Lance Corporal was literally lying across 2 desks like they were a couch, scrolling through his phone. "Gentlemen," she said more firmly this time. "Seats now." There was a long pause. Then slowly, with exaggerated movements and heavy sighs, they began to move. But it took a full 5 minutes before everyone was seated, and even then, the energy in the room was defiant. They'd made their point. She couldn't control them. Catherine swallowed her frustration and launched into her lesson. Today's topic was defensive perimeter establishment in hostile territory. She'd prepared detailed scenarios, brought maps, even created a hands-on exercise for the second half of class. When establishing a defensive position, she began, pointing to the map displayed on the screen. "Your first priority is securing sight lines and identifying potential breach points." "Ma'am?" It was the same sergeant from the first day. His name was Garrett, and he'd made himself the unofficial spokesperson for the class's discontent. "No offense, but this seems pretty basic. We covered this stuff in boot camp." "The fundamentals are basic," Catherine acknowledged, "but the application in complex environments is what we're focusing on today. If you'll let me continue." "I'm just saying," Garrett interrupted, leaning back in his chair. "Maybe we could move on to something more advanced, something relevant to what we'll actually face out there." "And what do you think you'll actually face out there, Sergeant?" Catherine asked, keeping her tone neutral. "With respect, ma'am, probably more than you've seen." The words landed like a slap. A few Marines shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but several others nodded in agreement. One corporal near the window actually laughed out loud. Catherine felt heat rising in her chest, but she forced it down. My experience isn't what we're here to discuss. Now, as I was saying, but it kind of is though, right? Another voice chimed in. This one belonged to a younger Marine, barely 20 with a baby face that still carried traces of acne. I mean, how are we supposed to take advice from someone who's never actually done this stuff? Who says I haven't? Catherine shot back before she could stop herself. The room went quiet for a moment. Garrett leaned forward, a challenge in his eyes. Okay then. Where'd you serve? What unit? Catherine felt the trap closing. If she didn't answer, she'd look like a fraud. If she did answer, she'd be opening doors she'd spent years trying to keep closed. That's not relevant to... So nowhere, Garrett concluded, sitting back with a satisfied smile. Look, ma'am, I'm sure you're very smart. I'm sure you've read a lot of books and taken a lot of courses. But there's a difference between knowing about combat and actually being in combat. And we need instructors who've been there. The murmur of agreement that rippled through the room felt like a wave crashing over her. Catherine gripped the edge of the podium, her knuckles white. Sergeant Garrett, we're not going to spend class time debating my qualifications. Either pay attention or leave. That's not really how it works, ma'am, Garrett said, his voice maddeningly calm. We can't just leave. We're assigned to this class, so we're stuck listening to theory from someone who got this job because, well, I don't know why. Diversity hire, maybe? Someone's wife who needed a job? Several Marines gasped. One corporal actually said, dude, too far. But the damage was done. Catherine felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Couldn't breathe. The room swam in front of her eyes, and she had to grip the podium harder to keep steady. Get out, she said quietly. Ma'am? Get out of my classroom, now. Garrett stood slowly, making a show of gathering his things. Happy to, ma'am. Beats sitting through another hour of this. He slung his backpack over his shoulder and headed for the door. As he passed Catherine, he said, just loud enough for the front row to hear. Hope they find us a real instructor soon. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam. Catherine stood there, facing the remaining Marines, trying to gather herself. She could see the range of reactions. Some looked uncomfortable, even ashamed. Others looked defiant, clearly agreeing with Garrett. A few just looked bored, like this was all just entertainment. Anyone else want to leave? She asked, hating how her voice shook slightly. No one moved, then let's continue. But it was impossible to continue. The lesson was ruined. Every word she spoke felt hollow. She could see them mentally checking out one by one. When she asked questions, she got silence. When she tried to engage them in discussion, she got blank stares or dismissive shrugs. The class period dragged on like a prison sentence. When it finally ended, the Marines filed out quickly, and Catherine heard fragments of their conversations drifting back through the open door. That was brutal. Garrett's right, though. What does she know? I feel kind of bad for her, but should have stood up for herself better. Catherine sank into the chair behind the desk and put her head in her hands. 20 years. She'd served for 20 years, and this is what it had come to. Being mocked by kids who weren't even born when she'd enlisted. Her phone buzzed. A text from the base administrator. Need to see you in my office. Garrett filed a complaint about being removed from class. Of course he did. The next few days were worse. Word had spread about the confrontation, and now she wasn't just facing skepticism. She was facing active resistance. Marines showed up late deliberately. They talked over her constantly. One class, someone had changed all her slides to ridiculous memes before she arrived. During a field exercise on Thursday, Catherine tried to demonstrate proper communication protocols during a tactical advance. She'd barely started her explanation when a corporal interrupted. Ma'am, no disrespect, but my little brother could teach this stuff and he's still in high school. When are we going to learn something actually useful? This is useful, Catherine said, trying to keep her patience. Communication breakdown is one of the leading causes of friendly fire incidents and mission failure. In theory, the corporal said, but in real combat situations, things don't go by the book. You've got to adapt. You've got to make calls based on what's actually happening, not what some manual says should happen. I agree completely, Catherine said, which is why understanding the fundamentals is so important. You need to know the rules before you can effectively break them. Do you know the rules, ma'am? Another Marine asked. Like from actual experience? And there it was again. The same question over and over. The assumption that she was just a civilian reading from a textbook, playing soldier without ever having been one. Catherine looked out at the field, at the obstacles and markers she'd set up for the exercise. She'd run drills like this 100 times in a dozen different countries, under actual fire. She'd made decisions that saved lives and decisions that haunted her still. She'd carried wounded friends through kill zones and held dying hands in the back of helicopters. She knew what combat felt like, smelled like, tasted like, but she couldn't tell them that. She'd left that life behind. She'd buried that version of herself along with too many friends to count. Coming back to base, taking this teaching job, had been her attempt to contribute without having to revisit all that pain, except the pain had found her anyway. It was there in every dismissive look, every mocking comment, every assumption that she didn't belong. That evening, Catherine sat in her small base office long after everyone else had gone home. Her laptop was open to a blank document where she was supposed to be writing next week's lesson plans, but she couldn't focus. On the wall across from her desk hung a faded photograph she'd brought from home. It showed a younger version of herself, face painted with camouflage, holding a rifle, grinning at the camera with a group of other Marines. They all looked so young, so alive, so sure they were invincible. 3 of the people in that photo were dead now. 2 others were permanently disabled. And Catherine had moved on, or tried to, carrying the weight of survival guilt everywhere she went. She'd thought teaching would be different. She'd thought she could help the next generation without having to explain why she was qualified to help them. She'd thought her knowledge would speak for itself. She'd been wrong. Catherine closed her laptop and stood up, turning off the office light. As she walked through the empty building toward the parking lot, she passed more bulletin boards, more photos of smiling Marines, more evidence of a brotherhood she no longer belonged to. Tomorrow was Friday. She had 2 more classes to get through, and then another week, and another. She just didn't know how much longer she could keep doing this. Friday morning came too quickly. Catherine had barely slept, her mind replaying every confrontation, every dismissive comment, every moment of disrespect from the past month. She'd seriously considered calling in sick, but that felt too much like giving up. And whatever else she was, Catherine Hayes wasn't a quitter. The classroom was already half full when she arrived, right on time. The Marines were in their usual groups, talking and laughing. She noticed they went quiet when she walked in, but not in a respectful way. More like they were just pausing their fun until she got boring enough to ignore again. Catherine set up her materials and took a breath. Today's lesson was on counterinsurgency tactics in urban environments. It was actually one of her best presentations, filled with practical scenarios and decision-making exercises. If anything could break through to them, this should be it. "Good morning," she began. "Today we're going to tackle one of the most challenging combat situations you'll face: counterinsurgency operations in populated urban areas." She clicked to her first slide, which showed a map of a fictional city. "You're leading a squad of 8 Marines. You've received intelligence that an insurgent cell is operating out of a residential neighborhood. Your mission is to locate and neutralize the threat while minimizing civilian casualties. Who can tell me what your first consideration should be?" Silence, not a single hand raised. Several Marines were already looking at their phones under their desks. "Anyone?" Catherine pressed. "Corporal Williams, what would be your approach?" Williams looked up, clearly annoyed at being called on. "I don't know, ma'am. Maybe evacuate civilians first?" "That's one option," Catherine said. "But evacuation can tip off the insurgents and give them time to escape or set up an ambush." "So what's the trade-off you're making?" Williams shrugged. "I guess you'd have to be there to know." The implication was clear, and you've never been there. Catherine felt her jaw clench but pushed forward. "Let's work through the scenario step by step. You've positioned your squad at the entrance to the neighborhood. You have limited intelligence about the exact location of the insurgents. What's your next move?" She looked around the room, waiting for someone, anyone, to engage. A few Marines stared back at her with blank expressions. Others weren't even pretending to pay attention anymore. Sergeant Garrett? She tried, even though he'd been nothing but hostile since day one. Garrett leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "Honestly, ma'am? This all feels pretty hypothetical. It's like playing a video game. Move here, consider this, watch out for that. But real combat isn't like that. Real combat is chaos. It's noise and fear and making decisions with incomplete information while people are shooting at you." "You're absolutely right," Catherine said, surprising him. Real combat is chaos, which is exactly why we train with scenarios like this. So when you're in that chaos, you've at least thought through similar situations. You've developed instincts. But how would you know? The question came from a lance corporal named Chen, who usually stayed quiet. His voice wasn't hostile, just genuinely confused. I mean, no disrespect, ma'am, but have you been in that chaos? Have you had to make those calls while people were shooting at you? Catherine stood very still. Every eye in the room was on her now, waiting for her answer. She could feel the weight of the question, the assumption behind it. They'd already decided she was just a civilian with a teaching credential, someone who'd read about combat in books but never lived it. This isn't about me, she said quietly. It's about preparing you for... But it kind of is about you, Chen interrupted, and there was something almost apologetic in his tone. Look, I'm not trying to be rude. I'm really not. But we've had instructors before who served, who had stories, who could tell us what it was really like, and when they taught us tactics, we knew they'd actually use those tactics. They'd survived because of them. That meant something. So you want war stories, Catherine said. Is that it? We want to know that you know what you're talking about. Garrett cut in, his voice harder. We want to know that when you tell us how to handle an ambush or clear a building or deal with civilians in a combat zone, you're not just repeating stuff you learned in some contractor training course. We want to know you've actually done it. The room had gone completely silent now. Even the Marines who'd been on their phones were paying attention. Catherine felt something breaking inside her chest like ice cracking on a frozen lake. You want to know if I've done it, she repeated slowly. Fine, yes, I've done it. I've led Marines in urban combat. I've made the exact decisions we're discussing in this scenario. I've dealt with insurgents hiding among civilians. I've had to choose between bad options and worse ones. Is that what you want to hear? Garrett's eyebrows went up. Okay, when? Where? What unit? Catherine felt the ice breaking wider. That's not... See, this is the problem, Garrett interrupted, standing up now. You can't just claim you've got experience and then refuse to back it up. That's not how this works. If you served, prove it. Tell us where. Tell us when. Give us something real instead of just getting defensive every time we ask a legitimate question. Sergeant, sit down, Catherine said, her voice tight. I'll sit down when you give us a straight answer, Garrett shot back. Did you serve or didn't you? And if you did, why won't you talk about it? What are you hiding? I'm not hiding anything, Catherine said, but even she could hear how weak it sounded. My service record isn't relevant too. It's completely relevant. Garrett was getting louder now, frustration spilling over. You're asking us to trust you with our training. You're asking us to learn tactics from you that might save our lives someday, and you won't even tell us if you've ever actually been in combat. That's not right. That's not fair to us. Several Marines nodded in agreement. One corporal called out, He's got a point, ma'am. Catherine felt cornered. She looked around the room at all these young faces, seeing the doubt, the frustration, the absolute certainty that she didn't belong here, and maybe they were right. Maybe this had been a mistake from the beginning. You want the truth? She heard herself say. The truth is that I came here to teach, not to relive my past. I came here to help you prepare for situations I hope you never have to face. But apparently that's not good enough for you. Apparently I need to prove myself over and over again, even though every tactic I've taught you is sound, even though every scenario I've presented is based on real-world situations. But you don't care about that. You care about whether I fit your image of what an instructor should look like. That's not fair, Chen said. We just want to know. I know what you want. Catherine cut him off, her voice rising despite her best efforts to stay calm. You want me to be someone I'm not anymore. You want me to dust off my old uniform and tell you stories about firefights and medals and all the things that make combat sound like an adventure instead of a nightmare. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I left that life behind for a reason. The classroom door opened. Catherine was so focused on the class that she didn't notice at first. But the Marines did. She saw their attention shift, their eyes moving to someone behind her. Don't stop on my account, a gruff voice said. This is just getting interesting. Catherine turned. Standing in the doorway was a Marine she didn't recognize. He was older, probably in his late 50s, with a weathered face and iron gray hair cut military short. His uniform carried the insignia of a gunnery sergeant, and his chest was decorated with more ribbons than Catherine could count in a glance. Gunnery Sergeant Rivera, Garrett said, suddenly standing at attention. Several other Marines followed suit. "We didn't know you were coming by, sir." "Clearly," Rivera said, his eyes moving around the room before settling on Catherine. He studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Catherine felt her heart pounding. This was it. He'd heard the commotion, heard her losing control of her class, and now he was going to report her. Maybe get her fired. Maybe end this disaster before it got any worse. But Rivera didn't say anything to her yet. Instead, he walked further into the room, his boots heavy on the floor. The Marines parted to let him through, everyone standing now at attention. He moved to the back of the classroom and leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Continue with your class, ma'am," he said to Catherine. "I'm just observing." Catherine felt her mouth go dry. This was worse than being reported. Now she had to continue teaching, while a senior NCO watched her struggle to maintain control, while these Marines sat there with barely concealed contempt, while she tried to justify her right to be here without revealing the very things she'd spent years trying to forget. She turned back to the class, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the podium. "As I was saying," she began, but her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. "The scenario involves—" "Ma'am, with respect," Garrett interrupted, emboldened by Rivera's presence. "I think we were in the middle of a more important discussion. You were about to tell us about your service record, about your actual combat experience." Catherine looked at him, then at Rivera standing in the back, then at all the young Marines watching her with varying degrees of skepticism and impatience. She felt the room closing in on her, felt the weight of their judgment and her own failures pressing down. "You really want to—" The silence in the classroom was absolute. Catherine stood frozen at the front, her hands gripping the podium so hard her knuckles had gone white. Rivera stared at her from the back of the room, his expression shifting from disbelief to certainty. "Gunnery Sergeant," Catherine said quietly. "I don't think—" "Iron Wolf at attention." Rivera's voice exploded through the classroom like a thunderclap. In one fluid motion, he snapped to perfect attention, his heels clicking together, his entire body rigid with military precision. His right hand came up in a salute so sharp it could have cut glass. The Marines stared in complete confusion. Garrett's mouth actually hung open. Shen looked from Rivera to Catherine and back again, trying to make sense of what was happening. No one moved. No one spoke. Catherine felt tears burning in her eyes. "Diego, please," she said softly. "Don't do this." But Rivera held his salute, his eyes glistening. "Captain Catherine Hayes, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Iron Wolf. Ma'am, permission to speak freely?" Catherine wanted to say no, wanted to stop this before it went any further, but she could see in Rivera's face that he needed this, that whatever he was about to say had been waiting inside him for a long time. "Permission granted," she whispered. Rivera's voice was thick with emotion, but he kept his salute. "Fallujah. November 2004. I was 23 years old. Corporal Diego Rivera, part of your rifle squad." The Marines in the classroom leaned forward, suddenly riveted. This wasn't what they'd expected. This wasn't some vague claim about serving somewhere. This was specific. This was real. "We were clearing a residential sector," Rivera continued. "House to house, room to room. It was the 4th day of the operation. We were exhausted. Running on adrenaline and fear. You were our squad leader, Captain. 26 years old, but you seemed older. Seemed like you'd been doing this forever." Catherine closed her eyes, the memories flooding back against her will. She could smell the smoke, taste the dust, hear the constant crack of gunfire. "We entered a compound," Rivera said. 3-story building, concrete and rebar. The intel said it was empty, but intel was wrong a lot back then. You went in first. You always went in first. Said you wouldn't ask us to do anything you wouldn't do yourself. Garrett was standing now, not at attention, just standing because sitting felt wrong. Other Marines were following suit. "We got to the 2nd floor," Rivera continued, his voice starting to shake. That's when it happened. The explosion. IED hidden in the stairwell. The whole thing came down. Fire dust screaming. I couldn't see anything. Couldn't hear anything except ringing in my ears. When the dust cleared enough, I realized I was trapped. Concrete slab across my legs. Couldn't feel them. Couldn't move. He paused, swallowing hard. I thought I was dead. I thought we were all dead. But then I heard your voice through the smoke. "Sound off." Everyone sound off. Like it was just a regular drill. Like the building wasn't collapsing around us. Catherine remembered. God, she remembered. the weight of the concrete dust in her lungs, the blood running down her face from a gash across her forehead, the panic she'd forced down because panic got Marines killed. 5 of us were trapped on that second floor, Rivera said. 2 dead instantly. 3 wounded, including me, and the insurgents knew we were there. They started firing from the buildings across the street. Then from the ground floor, we were surrounded, trapped, and bleeding out. The classroom was so quiet Catherine could hear the clock on the wall ticking. You organized us, Rivera said. Even though you were bleeding too. Even though your leg was broken, we found out later your femur was shattered in 3 places. You moved through that rubble like you weren't even hurt. You pulled Henderson out from under a collapsed wall. You put pressure on Michael's gut wound to keep him from bleeding out. You set up a defensive position with nothing but broken furniture and concrete chunks. Diego, Catherine started, but he shook his head. You need to let me finish this, ma'am. These Marines need to hear it. Rivera finally lowered his salute but remained at attention. We held that position for 6 hours. 6 hours, ma'am. You were on the radio, calling for extract, coordinating with the units outside. But the insurgents had the whole area locked down. RPGs, heavy machine guns. 3 different rescue attempts got pushed back. He turned to face the class now, his eyes sweeping over their stunned faces. You want to know what combat is really like? It's watching your captain drag herself across broken concrete on a shattered leg, because she refuses to let anyone else take point at the window. It's hearing her crack jokes while she's reloading her rifle with blood-soaked hands because she knows if she stops talking, we'll give up hope. A few Marines were crying now, though they probably didn't realize it. Garrett had sat back down, looking like he'd been punched in the stomach. You ran out of ammunition, Rivera said, turning back to Catherine. We all did, except for what we needed to keep for a last stand. But you wouldn't accept that. You made me and Henderson tourniquet each other while you kept watch. You found water in the rubble. Someone's storage tank had broken open, and made sure we all drank. You treated our wounds with torn pieces of your own uniform. Catherine's face was wet with tears now. She didn't try to hide them. When the sun started going down, Rivera said, you made a call. You said we couldn't wait anymore. Michaels was dying, and we'd all die if we stayed there through the night. So you called in an artillery strike on the insurgent positions. Danger close, so close that our own people thought you were crazy. But you calculated it perfectly. The strike came in, and in the chaos that followed, you let us out. He stepped forward, closer to the front of the room. You carried Michaels, a 200-pound man, and you carried him down 2 flights of destroyed stairs on a broken leg. Henderson and I could barely walk, but we followed you because we believed if you said we could make it, we could make it. We made it 2 blocks, Rivera said. That's when the sniper found us, 1 shot. Caught you in the shoulder, spun you around. You went down hard. But you didn't let go of Michaels. You rolled, covered him with your body, and kept crawling toward the extraction point. The classroom felt like a church now. Sacred, reverent. The QRF reached us 3 minutes later, Rivera said, but by then you'd lost so much blood you couldn't stand. Couldn't even tell them your name. You just kept saying, get them out first. Get my Marines out first. He was crying openly now, not bothering to wipe the tears away. You saved 5 lives that day, ma'am. 5 Marines who went home to their families because you refused to leave anyone behind. 5 Marines who got to live their lives, have kids, grow old because you were willing to sacrifice everything. Rivera straightened again, his voice stronger. The Corps gave you the Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star with Valor Device. You were 26 years old and you were a legend. Iron Wolf, that's what we called you, because you were tough as iron and fierce as a wolf protecting her pack. He looked around at the Marines. She served 3 tours, led countless operations, trained 2 entire platoons of new officers. Every Marine who served under her came home alive. Every single one. Catherine was shaking now, her arms wrapped around herself. Diego, please stop. They need to know why you left, Rivera said gently. Ma'am, permission to... They don't need to know that, Catherine said sharply. That's enough. But Rivera pressed on, his voice softer now. Your injuries. The broken leg that never healed, right? The shoulder that took 2 surgeries. The traumatic brain injury from the explosion that gave you migraines so bad you couldn't see straight. The Corps wanted you to take a desk job, but you said if you couldn't lead Marines in the field, you didn't want to lead them at all. He turned to Garrett specifically. You asked her why she won't talk about her service. This is why. Because every story comes with names of friends who didn't make it home. Every lesson she teaches you came at a price paid in blood and pain and nightmares. She's not hiding from her past. She's trying to honor it by making sure you don't have to learn these lessons the way she did. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Chen stood up. Ma'am, we owe you an apology. A huge apology. One by one, the other Marines stood. Some came to attention. Others just stood with heads bowed. Garrett was the last to stand, his face red with shame. Captain Hayes, Garrett said, his voice cracking. I've been a complete idiot. I've been disrespectful and arrogant, and I don't even know what to say. I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover it. Catherine wiped her eyes and tried to steady her voice. Sergeant, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Garrett interrupted. We all do. You came here to help us, and we treated you like you were the enemy. We made assumptions. We judged you, and the whole time you were just trying to teach us things that might save our lives. Another Marine spoke up, a quiet Lance Corporal named Anderson. Why didn't you tell us, ma'am? From the beginning? Catherine took a shaky breath. Because I didn't want to be Iron Wolf anymore. That person, she did what she had to do. But the cost was high, too high. When I left the course, I left her behind. I thought I could just be Catherine, a teacher, someone helping from the outside. But you can't separate them, Rivera said gently. Iron Wolf isn't who you were. It's who you are. It's why you're good at this, why you care so much about getting it right. Catherine looked around it. The classroom felt different when everyone sat back down. The energy had completely shifted. Where there had been resistance and mockery, now there was attention. Real attention, the kind Catherine had hoped for but never expected to see. Rivera moved to a seat in the back, settling in like he planned to stay for the rest of the class. Catherine took a moment to compose herself, wiping the last tears from her face and squaring her shoulders. The pain of the memory still echoed in her chest, but something else was there too, something that felt almost like relief. All right, she said, her voice steadier now. Let's get back to the lesson. We were discussing counterinsurgency operations in urban environments. She clicked to bring the slide back up, the map of the fictional city filling the screen. You're leading a squad of 8 Marines. You've received intelligence about an insurgent cell in a residential neighborhood. Your mission is to locate and neutralize the threat while minimizing civilian casualties. This time, when she paused, hands went up. Actual hands raised voluntarily. Catherine felt a small smile tug at her lips. Yes, Anderson? Ma'am, first question would be about the quality of the intelligence. How reliable is the source? Because if we're going into a populated area based on bad intel, we're risking civilian lives for nothing. Excellent question, Catherine said, and she meant it. Intelligence in counterinsurgency is rarely perfect. You have to weigh the reliability of your source against the urgency of the threat. What factors would you consider? Garrett's hand went up. Catherine nodded to him, feeling a strange twist in her stomach. An hour ago, he'd been her biggest antagonist. Now he was actively participating. Source history, ma'am, Garrett said. Have they been reliable before? Also, can we corroborate the intel with other sources? And what's the cost-benefit? If the target is high value, you might take more risk. If it's low level, maybe you wait for better confirmation. That's exactly right, Catherine said. She added some notes to the slide. In this scenario, your source has been 70% reliable in the past. You have partial corroboration from signals intelligence, chatter indicating increased insurgent activity in the area. The target is believed to be a mid-level facilitator responsible for several IED attacks. What's your call? Go, said Chen without hesitation, but with caution. Set up surveillance first, confirm the target, then move in with a plan. Catherine nodded. Good instinct. Let's talk about how you'd set up that surveillance. She pulled up another slide showing the neighborhood layout. You've got buildings on all sides, narrow streets, lots of civilians moving through the area. Where do you position your teams? For the next hour, the class was everything Catherine had imagined it could be. Marines asked intelligent questions. They challenged her scenarios with thoughtful alternatives. They debated tactics among themselves, weighing risks and benefits. When Catherine corrected someone's approach, they listened instead of bristling. When she asked for examples, they volunteered. Rivera sat in the back, a small smile on his weathered face, occasionally nodding when a Marine made a particularly good point. At one point, Garrett raised his hand again. Ma'am, in the scenario, what if civilians won't evacuate? Like, you've confirmed the target is in a specific building. But there are families in the surrounding structures who refuse to leave. Catherine paused, a real memory flashing through her mind. She pushed it away gently. That's one of the hardest situations you'll face. You can't force civilians to leave their homes, but you also can't let that paralyze your mission. What would you do? Adjust the approach, Garrett said. Maybe instead of a direct assault, you set up containment and try to draw the insurgents out. Or you wait for a better opportunity when civilians aren't in the immediate danger zone. Both valid options, Catherine said. But what if waiting isn't an option? What if you have intelligence that the insurgents are planning an attack within hours? The class went quiet, thinking. Finally, Anderson spoke up. Then you do your best to minimize risk, but you go. Because letting them carry out an attack that might kill dozens of people isn't an option either. You make the hard call. And that's the reality of counterinsurgency, Catherine said softly. There are rarely good options, only less bad ones. The key is to train your judgment so that when you're in that moment under pressure, you can make the best decision possible with the information you have. A hand went up in the middle of the room. A young lance corporal named Foster who'd barely spoken all semester. Ma'am, how do you live with it? When you make the call and it goes wrong? The question hung in the air. Catherine could feel Rivera's eyes on her from the back of the room. She could see the genuine concern in Foster's face. This wasn't about tactics anymore. This was about the human cost of war. You carry it, Catherine said simply. Every decision that costs lives, you carry it. Every face, every name. It becomes part of you. The only way to honor that weight is to keep going. Keep serving. Keep trying to do better. And if you're lucky enough to get out, you try to pass on what you learned so maybe the next generation makes fewer mistakes. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Foster nodded. Thank you, ma'am. For being honest, Catherine smiled. That's what we're here for. Honest preparation for hard realities. The rest of the class period flew by. They worked through 3 more scenarios, each one building in complexity. The Marines engaged with every problem, offering solutions, questioning assumptions, learning. It was everything Catherine had hoped teaching would be. When the class ended, no one rushed for the door. Several Marines came up to the front asking follow-up questions, requesting additional resources to study. Garrett waited until the others had left, then approached Catherine with hesitant steps. Ma'am, I need to apologize again, he said. Not just for today, for everything. I was way out of line. Catherine studied him for a moment. Why were you so resistant, Sergeant? It wasn't just about my credentials. Garrett looked down. Honestly? Fear, I think. We've got deployment orders. We ship out in 3 months, and I'm scared. We're all scared. So when you showed up and you didn't look like what we expected, didn't talk like the instructors we were used to, I think I used that as an excuse. Like if I could convince myself you didn't know what you were talking about, maybe that meant the mission ahead wasn't as scary as it felt. Catherine felt her heart twist. And now? Now I'm still scared, Garrett admitted. But I think I'd rather be scared and learn from someone who actually knows what they're talking about than be scared and pretend the danger isn't real. That's wisdom, Sergeant, Catherine said. Fear isn't the enemy. Ignorance is. Use these next 3 months. Learn everything you can. Ask every question. And when you get over there, remember that your job isn't to be fearless. It's to take care of your Marines and complete your mission. Garrett straightened. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. He paused. Would you be willing to share more? About your experiences? Not as war stories, but as lessons. Catherine hesitated, then nodded slowly. When it's relevant to the training, yes. I won't glorify it, but I won't hide from it either. Not anymore. After Garrett left, Rivera approached. He looked older than he had at the start of class, the emotion of the past hour evident in the lines of his face. You okay, Diego? Catherine asked. I should be asking you that, ma'am, he said with a small smile. That wasn't easy what I did. Making you relive all that. No, Catherine agreed. But it was necessary. Maybe I needed it too. I've been trying so hard to be someone else that I forgot there's no shame in being who I was, who I am. Rivera nodded. For what it's worth, ma'am, I think you're a hell of a teacher. Even before they knew your background, the material was solid. The scenarios were relevant. You were reaching them even if they didn't want to admit it. I appreciate that, Catherine said. How did you end up here today anyway? Pure chance, Rivera said. I'm stationed across base, but I was walking by and heard raised voices. Thought maybe there was trouble. When I looked in and saw you, He shook his head. I couldn't believe it. Iron Wolf teaching tactics to a bunch of kids who didn't even know what they had. They're not kids, Catherine said. They're Marines. Good ones, I think, once they drop the attitude. Agreed, Rivera said. He hesitated, then added, You know, there's a few of us still around from the old days. Hernandez is teaching at Quantico. Patterson is a training NCO at Pendleton. If you ever want to grab a beer, swap stories, remember the ones who aren't here anymore. We get together sometimes. Catherine felt tears threatening again and blinked them back. I'd like that. I've been alone with this for a long time. You don't have to be, Rivera said simply. After he left, Catherine spent a few minutes organizing her materials and updating her notes for the next class, but her mind wasn't on lesson plans. She was thinking about the faces of her students when they finally understood, when they finally saw her not as an obstacle but as a resource, when they finally opened themselves up to actually learning. The following Monday, Catherine arrived early to set up the classroom. She expected to find it empty, but instead the Marines were already there. All of them. Sitting quietly in their seats, notebooks open, waiting. Garrett stood when he saw her. Good morning, Captain Hayes. The others echoed him. Good morning, ma'am, Catherine.